Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Moderator, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Hi, I'm Katie Dean, Executive Editor of the Cap Times, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's Cap Times Idea Fest. This is our 4th annual event, but the first time we're presenting the festival virtually. Our theme this year is 2020 Changes Everything. With the COVID-19 pandemic, its effect on the health, education, and economic well-being of our community, as well as the calls for change from the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a lot to talk about. This year's lineup is our best yet. We believe Idea Fest has grown into a signature event on the Madison calendar. It is also an important showcase for the Cap Times, our locally owned and century-old news publication. If you're not already, we hope you'll consider becoming a Cap Times member. As a member, you'll have access to special Idea Fest programs, plus benefits throughout the year. You'll also be supporting an independent and trustworthy local media source at a critical time. Find the details online at membership.captimes.com. I'd like to thank the Burrish Group at UBS, which is the presenting sponsor of Idea Fest and has been with us since the start, as well as our numerous other sponsors. So please enjoy this session of Idea Fest. Thank you and welcome.
Hello everyone, I'm Jessica Cavazos with the Wisconsin Latino Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to Cap Times Idea Fest. Today we have a great panel that's with us, and I am so happy to introduce all these individuals that are really making an impact on the economic front for Wisconsin. And today's topic is, with Madison fighting for equity, why are Latino issues being missed? And first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Eugenia Podesta. She is the board member for the Latino Chamber of Commerce, but also a senior strategist and organizer at Vital Voices, an international nonprofit government organization in Washington that supports growth in women-led businesses and mid-sized enterprises. She's also the co-founder of our Madison-based Synergy co-working space and lives here in Madison and also wants to find solutions for leadership development. Welcome, Eugenia.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being with us. And up next, we have Justice Castañeda, who leads Commonwealth Development, a local development organization specializing in affordable housing development, economic development, business incubation, and one of the most importantly is youth development and mentorship in Madison. And last but not least, we have Ramon Ortiz, Dr. Ramon Ortiz, who is a vice chair of the Latino Chamber of Commerce, also an associate dean in the School of Arts and Sciences at Madison College. He has his PhD in educational leadership and policy analysis from UW-Madison and an MBA from UW-Whitewater. Welcome, Dr. Ramon Ortiz.
Thank you for having me.
And this is going to be a very interesting topic because I think privately we've all talked about this topic, and I think it continues to be at the highlight, at the forefront of a lot of closed door conversations. And so we're going to start with this first question that is, COVID crisis shines a spotlight on socioeconomic inequities in the United States. And one of the questions is, what do you see as some of the inequities with response to COVID in our communities as a whole? And Justice, I think that this is a conversation we had several times this month, this past month, and I just wanted to know what your perspective is on how COVID shined a light on these inequities?
So I think one thing that we're seeing across the board, and I think it's important for us to kind of get at this today in this conversation, but the Latinx population is extraordinarily diverse and dynamic within itself. And so something we're seeing, so the way, to say that something is affecting us or is the population as a whole, it's, I think it forces us to really start thinking about it, disaggregating us as a unique and dynamic population and really looking at how it's affecting a lot of us. And I think one thing, I talk a bit about the Southwest of the United States where you have, and I would say all over, but we represent as a Latinx population. When we have, in terms of political constituencies, we have one of the fastest growing political constituencies in the United States is Latinx conservatives. And then on the other side of this, or within the same region, you have the internment and the caging of families, in the same area. And so I say all that just to say that those represent extreme poles, but also represent the inclusivity. So when you talk about how is it affecting us, I think when we're thinking about a lot of the labor right now, it's come to light in terms of the fires that are happening in California. A lot of the folks who are involved in the harvesting of our food, of our produce, that's us, and having to do that in air that already is compromised because of the smoke, and then also doing that with the context of a disease that attacks your respiratory system. We have that situation, and then a lot of it in terms of meat packing and all these things. We're seeing how this affects our people in very severe ways. But I also think that it's really important, just kind of as a backdrop as we enter into this conversation, to really acknowledge that diversity and dynamicism.
Right. And Eugenia, I think that you've been a longtime resident of Madison. You've seen the population probably increase since the time your parents came here. And have you seen issues get better, or have you seen it magnified even more?
I would say there's absolutely a magnification, but I also think that this diversity that Justice mentioned has become more and more complex, right? We have first generation, second generation, third generation. From those groups, it's people coming from different backgrounds, different educational backgrounds, having escaped war, different types of trauma. So when we look at the complexity, I mean, the migrant farm worker community, which we know is very, very much a key focal point in Wisconsin, unfortunately, I have to say that a lot of the same issues that existed when we moved to Madison, which was about 30 years ago, continue to exist and are absolutely exacerbated, right? We know that the Latinx community continues to be one of the most underinsured, right, and under-remunerated. And so I don't see the advancement that you would have hoped to see after 30 years.
Right. Dr. Ortiz, do you think that COVID highlighted some of these issues and differences? And, what can you say about what you see now versus, before COVID, pre-COVID?
Yeah, I think one of the things that COVID did is it peeled back the veneer of civil society and exposed the ugly reality of race and classism in America and in Wisconsin and Dane County as well. What do I mean by that? Well, when you had the stay-at-home order, we had a separation of two classes, those that could stay at home, earn a living from home, and those that were called essential workers. Essential workers meant essentially you had to leave your home, risk your health to go earn a living in support of those who had the privilege of staying at home. That was disproportionately people of color, and that hit people of color extremely hard, all Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, but it had a particularly added layer of damage done to the Latino community because we have that extra layer of marginalization. What do I mean by that? The Latino community suffers from all the same things as other people of color. Within our community, we have from 10 to 15% of our population that is undocumented. We live in mixed households, so undocumented aren't just a separate group, they're integrated in our community. And if you look at relief, everybody was hurting during this time and is still hurting. Unemployment insurance. If you are not a US citizen or resident, you don't get access to unemployment, despite the fact that, say, in Dane County, the immigrant community in 2018 paid $124 million in taxes, local taxes. The CARES Act, it was specifically designed to deprive relief to anybody who was undocumented. And inadvertently, even those that married someone who filed with the TIN number were deprived of relief. So you had the intentional weaponization of the state apparatus against our community. So while we were disenfranchised, you had then the system weaponized against us, because currently it is seen as avant-garde to be anti-immigrant and anti-Latino. You add to that, the constant desire to create this idea of a public charge to deprive people the possibility of being legalized. And now you have the people within our community, the most vulnerable, the undocumented, not going and seeking free services, whether it's free clinics, for the fear of being identified as a public charge and then being deprived of the opportunity of staying in this country with their children. So I think COVID peeled back that veneer of civility and exposed our society for the classism and racism that exists in the rawest sense. I mean, at a point where we're supposed to come together and help one another, certain groups, and in particular the Latino undocumented community, was deprived of its humanity.
And in that respect, I mean, we're talking about local government. Let's say how local government, how would you score Justice, how local government is doing to address some of the disparities? And again, disparities, inequities, I mean, these are challenges that the Latino and non-Latino communities, communities of color are facing. And so how would you say that the government's doing?
Such a big question. To Dr. Ortiz's point, I think the idea of superfluous labor versus essential, because I think that's a huge point that he made, and I think it's a good segue, because a lot of if you say that it's essential, like ideally, in basic, simple one-on-one economics, is that would mean that the demand should in some way reflect the compensation or the way that we treat them, or the role, or the way that we hold it in a reverie, when it's kind of the opposite. And I thought that was a really great point. And I think when you think about that right now, just going back to a lot of the points that he brought up about where we fall in terms of representation because of documentation status, because of persecution, because of all these things, I think as we continue to get more different types of stimulus, I think it's going to be critical for our local officials to recognize that. So I'm thinking right now of the money that was given out for housing. There was not a lot of money. I mean, the rent rolls in Dane County per month are somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 million a month. And so the $10 million that the county put out actually was not that much. But I think, to the points brought up by Dr. Ortiz, is when you're thinking about that, if you know that that's not that much in terms of the mileage, it is essential that you're saying, all right, so who are the folks who are not going to have access to these funds because of whether it's their documentation status, because of the way they get paid, so whether it was under the table, or, and let's recognize that that's there. I think it's very represented in and within the Latinx population, but it's also in other parts of the population, and saying, how are we prioritizing that as we move forward with different policy interventions? And I think that we need to be more deliberate as a whole as we're thinking about that. And I think it's something that we struggle with. I also, I think more than ever, it's critical for us to position ourselves and to understand where we fall in terms of a lot of the other movement work that's going on and supporting things like the Black Lives Movement. Because what can happen is you get into this thing where everybody gets into their own little cabal and they dig in, and then it's a matter of, whose needs are the most essential. But I think that, when you get a situation where you have a number of things happening, and the pandemic moderating so much of it, it's critical that we're thinking about that and then taking those things into account as we think about different, interventions and ways that we're supporting people.
Right, so I think you're also saying alignment's going to be really important. I mean, when you have all these subgroups, I think what we saw in this last stimulus is that, our communities really did get the crumbs. I mean, we didn't really get a lot of positioned funding for the issues that are the greatest in our community. Would you say that, or would you say that there's still room for improvement?
So I think it gets into this thing about the way that it's not just what was given, or it wasn't just the amount of support, it was the processes through which that support is given. And I think that's where it gets really sticky, right? And I think that's where we need to be more direct in coming up with, I think, very deliberate conversations about the conduit through which the support is given, so that we're taking a lot of these things into consideration. And I'll let someone else jump in on that.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to that.
And I think that just playing off of that, as far as like, let's say when PPP came, right? Eugenia, I think you could tell us that it wasn't the most easiest of applications and processes, and
Absolutely.
And I don't think there was enough information for our population early on.
I think hands down, to Justice's point, right? It's not just the relief, it's the process. And looking at how much red tape there is, how many barriers there are to even access the information is the starting point. But then actually filling out the information. If you're feeling vulnerable, how are you going to feel comfortable sharing some of that very private information? And we actually have to take a step back, and to Justice's point, reality is reality. We might not like it. We might not like that certain things happen the way that they do, but this is the world that we live in. And if we're actually going to be able to support those that are most vulnerable, how do we best do that? By those that have the trust of these communities and these populations, right? Really understanding what the challenges are, really understanding what the needs are, and serving as that conduit through a process that's not riddled with red tape. Like, if we're trying to help, let's help then. Why do we have to create all these things that really just make it more difficult, right?
And I think, just seeing how the population was excluded from the initial, just all the areas of help were, I felt we were like very much excluded until people started making noise, right? And that's why we have people like Dr. Ortiz, who doesn't mind making noise on the inequities. And what can you tell me that let's say a year ago, the disparities that were happening within the Latino community, were they the same than in the present time, where now we have like a trifecta of pandemics going on? I mean, what would you say is the difference?
Well, I think, like other groups of color, we had our challenges, issues of child poverty and things like that, educational achievement gap, all the things that are across the board. One of the saving graces of our community was that we're a very entrepreneurial population. And one of the things that this pandemic did is it shut down and destroyed many small businesses. So we took an additional blow on top of the pandemic. And I think if you would look at it in terms of the social economic position of Latinos in Dane County and in Wisconsin and in the nation, because to understand Latinos in Dane County, you have to first understand the national context, the state context, to really understand the local context. We're a demographic wave. There's certain changes that are going to occur regardless. Just like 1 + 1 = 2, there will be a systematic change that will sweep across all institutions within the next 2 generations, regardless of who's president, regardless of what your immigration policies are. This will happen. And I think for us, with the loss of small businesses, we were hit extra hard. And I would say we've probably slid back in terms of economic progress. Even things like some of the CARES relief for the PPE for small business loans and things like that. All of that was not targeted to people of color. It was not marketed to people of color specifically. It was very general. And then for those of us that have a language barrier, there was that extra layer. And then those that don't have documentation, who may have been successful business people, there's the added barrier of not being able to access resources, even though in some instances, if they're state resources, they're legally able to access that as residents of the state of Wisconsin. The only monies that somebody who is working with an ITIN number cannot access is federal money, not state money. But that lack of understanding, that lack of empathy sometimes impedes us from getting access to the necessary resources, not just in Dane County, I would say in the state of Wisconsin, and also on the national level.
One question I had for you, Eugenia, is when we're talking about inequities, I think we have to talk about everything wrong that's going on. How would you create, or what solutions do you think should happen, especially with the inequities that are going on with our small businesses qualifying? What do you think should happen now?
I mean, honestly, building on my last point, like what is the reality here, right? And if we're looking at creating processes through which you access financial resources that requires 2 years of taxes, that requires all these things that we understand certain demographics do not have, why are we doing that? That honestly to me just tells me that we really don't care and we're not trying to serve them. So we either create it to make sure that it gets to those that need it, or stop acting like we really have that intent, right? The other piece that I see is a huge opportunity for us. And we have organizations like Justice's organization, the Chamber, others. There's a huge opportunity to really understand what the gaps are and how to further bring these organizations together to really create that ecosystem and pipeline of support to know where are we failing and really organize behind getting resources for those pieces, right? Because I don't think we have, as a community, a clear understanding of the impact that we're already having and why some of these institutions are better positioned to come up with solutions and to implement those solutions, frankly.
Justice, do you think that when these monies are coming down, are the right people at the table delegating what resources are going to go where?
You know, it's interesting. I just finished the task force on government structure here with the city, and about a 2-year project. And thinking about all the nuances and the differences and the diversity within our population, I think that the access to democratic processes and institutions is as important as the representation of. And so I think we focus a lot on representation of. And I think that that's okay. I think having folks at the table, but because of again, that diversity within our population, you know, the Madison and ubiquity, I always feel like community here is used and like, it means everything. It's like, what is the community? It's like everything, right? And right. A lot of times, you know, it's the people I know and the people you don't know anything about, or, you know, and so like, we focus on, there's a lot of jockeying for this instead of really thinking about how do we get the people who we're talking about more access to. A really great example, it's so interesting to think about given COVID, but in that process, we floated towards the end the idea that the city council committees, they needed to allow for access to their meetings virtually. Because the idea that you're gonna have to get to the city county building from wherever you live, and when you look at where our populations live at the periphery in general, so the distance down there, you go down there and then you gotta wait, and then you get 3 minutes, and there's no guarantee anyone's gonna be listening to you. They're gonna be up like eating a sandwich and like, you know, or whatever, maybe they're listening, but the point is, as we said, that's antiquated. That was looked at like we were crazy, like we were gonna destroy Madison democracy because we were suggesting that we needed access because a lot of our folks are working and everything else, but they have a lot to say. But so instead what you get is you say, well, then you get representation to say, well, I represent all of them. Well, maybe you do, and maybe, you know, I take it, but also let's give them access to it. And I think with COVID, we've seen that that's changed considerably. Now, it's a given that we can get people access to meetings and to a lot of these little functions of our local democracy without having, you know, a lot of these barriers to it. And so I think about stuff like that. How are we not, because the way we always go and the way it always goes is you get folks jockeying for who represents who, instead of really looking for more ways to alleviate the restrictions or the pressures so that we can lift up the voices and let folks represent themselves. And I think that's a big thing, right?
Dr. Ramon, can you talk about, and putting on your dean hat, right? What are some of the issues that you see that are impacting, you know, just overall the education of our Latino populations, the mobility of the Latino population, because a lot of us, we deal in family and not individual, right? So what would you say, in going towards what Justice was saying, you know, there are inequities, there are, you know, how do you, what solutions do you see that would impact our future, the future generations of Latinos and our families?
Well, again, I start by saying that to understand the local context, you have to understand the national context and the statewide context. You know, we all hear about minorities being the majority population by 2050, but there's always a caveat to that. That is occurring because a third of your population in 2050 will be Latinos, Spanish-speaking population. In Wisconsin, if you look at, I'm a native Wisconsinite to the extent that one can be. I mean, I wasn't born in Madison, but I came here when I was about 1 year old, and I'm 47 now. So I've seen the changing demographic occur. And just to show how quickly it happened, in 1980, there was about 60,000 Latinos in the entire state of Wisconsin. By 2000, you're looking at about 197,000. And 2020, we're at 370,000. We're now the largest ethnic minority in the state of Wisconsin. That number is going to continue to grow. Within the next 3 decades, we'll converge on 1 million. Now, if you look at education, as it's discussed, we haven't really been integrated into the discussion of the achievement gap in the state of Wisconsin. I think part of it is because there's certain narratives associated with race and ethnicity that might have been true 30 years ago, and that has been completely disrupted by the presence of immigrants who don't quite fit neatly into one box. And I also think that there's also, the inability to address the demographic trend in terms of high school graduation. If you look at information from the UW Population Lab, within the state of Wisconsin, from an economic standpoint, which is tied to education, virtually all groups are going to decline, with the exception of 2 groups of high school graduating seniors, Latinos and Asians. Those are the 2 fastest growing populations in the state of Wisconsin. Yet Wisconsin has yet to, let alone grapple with its racial disparities, which is, it has one of the greatest racial disparities between Black and white. It has yet to even grapple with that, let alone try to address the complexity of Latinos and Asians within this new milieu of race and politics in the state of Wisconsin. And I think Dane County, it's still a relatively majority population county. 84% of the population is white. If you took Latinos, which are the second largest population in Dane County, Asians and African Americans, they might comprise 20% of the population. That's not a significant part, but that population is going to grow, and you're starting to see those pressures within the school district. You're starting to see things like, you're seeing that within K through 12, K through 16 partnerships, like Madison College reaching out to the Madison Metropolitan School District via their STEM Academy. You're starting to see more articulation agreements. You're even starting to see UW systems starting to look at what would otherwise have been seen as pools of students that would have been overlooked, students that would have been defined as at risk, right? Essentially, you're students of color who are graduating at maybe lower academic scores, but need additional services to succeed in college. That is the population that the next generation of colleges and universities are going to have to compete for. That is where your dollars are going to be. So I think in terms of what we can do, first of all, we're doing it right now. We're speaking out on the subject, right? In 1980, when there were 60,000 Latinos in the state of Wisconsin, we were invisible. Now, the issue is that we're disrupting the normal discourse. We're now 370,000 people in the state of Wisconsin. We're demanding to be involved and represented in local government. We're asking to be a part of conversations involving education. Our presence needs to be felt. We need to articulate that. And we also need to reach out to one another across the aisle and across various ethnic groups and agenda link. Educational disparities are just as real in the Black community as they are in the Latino community and the Hmong community. I mean, we need to understand that though we need to identify our issues and be true to our issues, we need to be able to connect with a broader mass, a broader coalition, if we're ever going to move institutions in a direction that is beneficial to people of color and, Latinos as well.
And I was just gonna add, from the numbers that you said, I mean, Latinos they say they've increased 25% from the last census. I mean, the numbers are outstanding, and so I agree with you that there has to be more of a concentrated effort on education and mobilization of even training programs. Justice, you were going to say?
Well, I just 2 things with that. First of all, I think the thing with the numbers, and I did this when I did a project on Madison I spent a few years doing this, the early teens. When they talk about the population, Madison literally imports white people every year. Dane County does because of the university. And So at any given moment, you're going to get this number that it's 80%. But when you're looking at who's born here and you look at a composition of our schools, something we were talking about before we got going was the representation under the age of 18. But this is the same with every one of the, whether it's Black folks, Latinx, or the Hmong population, we are heavily represented in terms of who is born here. But when you have that import effect where you're bringing people here, the thing is that when you graduate, so the likelihood of one of our folks graduating from a high school here is very high. But there is no real, that credential, so it's like this thing where we ask teachers to sell and students to buy a credential that has no cachet in your local economy. Because the people you're competing with are graduates of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, which is overwhelmingly white, and the import folks. So they're always using that number. We found that number was off. If you really look at who's born here and you separated the economy that way, you would find that we are heavily represented in terms of the people here. We're just not heavily represented in terms of how they think about prioritizing resources and everything else. And I just, to kind of, I thought what he said was very eloquent. I think that everything Dr. Ortiz just said is why it's so critical for me to say why we need to be in solidarity with the movement for Black lives, because I think, especially in an educational context, that I think that that's absolutely right. It hasn't gotten better. The Black-white disparities here have remained stagnant or have gotten more severe or more complex and nuanced over the last 50 years. And I think if you go at the roots of them in terms of representation of your educator, your teacher force, in terms of curriculum that represents your people, the core tenets, and then lack of persecution by the state as we started this off, right? So we should be because we need to be in solidarity with that conversation, because the core tenets of how that Black-white achievement gap exists and how it's exacerbated, how it's aggravated, are going to affect us as well. And it would behoove us to really take the opportunity now, with our population growing the way it is, to jump in, full on, to make sure that we're addressing that stuff and lifting that stuff up.
Thank you, Justice. I think that's a good segue. We are so happy to have this panel, because this panel really is making a concerted effort to change not only the narrative, but the future of how Latinos are seen in the state and how Latinos are able to progress through just positive and mobilizing ideas. But I want to take this moment to thank our sponsors at Cap Times and Ideas Fest for this wonderful dialogue.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.
Welcome back to Cap Times Idea Fest. We are having a wonderful dialogue here on Madison Fighting for Equity. Why are Latino issues being missed? And again, I'm going to start with Dr. Ramon Ortiz, who always has the right answers. And most of all, I think some of those private conversations that we all have had, very candid about the issues that are going on. I mean, I see Madison, and I've only been here 4 years, but I see Madison now more than ever. I mean, there's not only poverty rates going up, but also, incidents with our police and violence in our city and domestic violence. Dr. Ortiz, what can you say, or what would you like to see happen, in really paying attention and mobilizing or helping our communities progress?
Well, I think first, it comes down to looking inward, right? Within our communities, we cannot expect anybody to advocate for us if we're not willing to advocate for ourselves. So we need to not apologize for breathing oxygen. What do I mean by that? We are here. We are residents of the state of Wisconsin. We've been here. My family's been here almost 50 years. And as such, we're contributors to this society. We're taxpayers. We're participants in civic life, and our interests should be heard. And one of the things that we should do in terms of how we engage, I think, state government, local government, social institutions, demand authentic diversity. And what do I mean by that? Diversity should be defined by the population, the demographics of the population. It means different things for different areas of the country. If you are in Arizona or New Mexico, out in a rural area, maybe you're talking about Native American Hopi Indian tribes, right? If you're talking about Wisconsin, well, you've got to deal with the number of different groups that are here. You've got to recognize the changing face of Wisconsin, which is going to become increasingly Latino. Like I said, we're 370,000. We will be about 1 million within the next 30 years. If Wisconsin is going to have an honest conversation about economic development, they cannot overlook the demographic and economic imperative, which is the Latino community. And we should not be shy about stating that in any context, whether it's with government officials, whether it's a social circle, whether it is among nonprofits. So that would be the first thing. The second thing, again, I cannot emphasize the need to agenda link. We exist in this society. We don't live in a vacuum, though we need to have our own ethnic space to feel comfortable, and we need to have a crystallized sense of ethnic identity so that we know what our issues are, and recognize the diversity within our group of Latinos. We also need to find common ground outside of our group. We need to understand the disparities that exist in other groups and be able to effectively agenda link. Nothing gets done without a coalition. To have effective social change, we must be able to partner not just with other groups within diverse disadvantaged contexts. We need to look at partnering with certain areas of industry. You look at the dairy industry. The Latino population comprises 50% of their workforce. We should be engaging with them, asking them, what is your agenda for affecting change in our community and improving the lives of our community? Because we know we're serving your community, 50% of the dairy industry, right? So things like that, I would suggest.
On that point, on industry, Eugenia, and I know that you travel the world. You help with, helping startups and helping those who are who may need a lot more direction or funding. Or what would you say? And keep it in mind with what Dr. Ortiz said. But what would you say that can be a solution? I mean, not only at the global and national, but since we do have such a diverse community here, what would you say some of the solutions that can impact through that alignment or strategy? What would you say would be some of those solutions?
Oh, I have many ideas, right? I mean, I think for me, one of the things that is glaring is we continue to spend time on conversations and not on actually funding innovations for social change. We have tons of ideas. We have brilliant ideas that have been shared. We know this. Why do we keep having conversations? Can we now just galvanize around support to try some things out and understand that we need a diverse plethora of solutions, right? Because we also don't want to go in the direction of finding one silver bullet, because that doesn't exist, right? My experience, obviously, my background is in international development, and you see it play out there all the time as well. It's like it becomes this monolithic issue. All the funding goes towards that one issue. All the funding goes towards that one population. And then we start falling behind in everything else. So we have to have a holistic approach. We have to understand all of the elements that actually are conducive to a thriving population, right?
And Justice, being that you've been at some of these conversations, I mean, you've had even more than I think the three of us, been at the forefront with these coalitions and committees. I mean, do you think effective, not just dialogue, but actually to do items. Action.
Let's do this.
So I just want to take what they just said. I thought if you just think about what, look at concrete solutions. First and foremost, right now, because of the way our population is spread out in Madison, this is what we found in the Task Force on Government Structure. Right now, we fundamentally are excluded from democratic processes in electoral politics in Madison, Wisconsin. That needs to be fixed. And I think that we laid out a number of recommendations about actual access to this. Again, It's access to it. I always think it's interesting that whenever you talk about access to government, people will automatically start telling you how many people of color are on the council. As if folks of color, it's beyond us to vote for white folks if they are in our best interest. We've been doing it forever. So it's just the other way. The people have a hard time voting for us, you know what I'm saying? Even if it's against their best interest, they'll vote for a white folks before they vote for someone of color, even against their own interest. We vote for white folks all the time if we have access to it. Right, and all I'm saying is that representation doesn't just mean, oh, well, the people up there look this way, right? So the first thing, access to that. Second thing, when we're talking about the concept of talking about the diversity as if it's in the pejorative, I think it was so critical, it's such a good point, because it's not. When you tell me about the disparities, what I'm telling you is that your economy is not leveraging the asset that our populations represent if you could turn us on. What does that mean? Well, I'll give you some real quick things. In terms of housing, right now, when we talk about the housing that's being built, we talked about a lot of our populations are representing the lowest wage workers in the county. None of the housing that's being built is actually being built to be affordable to the bottom 2 quintiles of the income distribution. So when we say we're going to build affordable housing, we need to be talking deliberately about for whom is that housing affordable. That's the first thing. Transit. We need regional transit right now. And I know when everyone talks about that, they always think trains first. I don't know that trains is where you start, but we need regional transit. Janesville is 35 minutes away from South Madison right now. Every place that I've lived, I just moved back to Madison 3 years, it's been 44 months now. That's not prohibitive. And you have all these nodes around us, and there's a lot of jobs, whether it's in agriculture or manufacturing, in the region, that there is no network of transit. And we are losing because we don't have access to it. And I think it's very, very critical. In terms of businesses, for small business support, another thing in terms of entrepreneurial spirit, in terms of, we don't have a culture of VC in Madison in general. And equity is very hard to come by for small businesses, especially for working capital. What a lot of the money is geared towards is just getting a business to open, but not to support them once we're actually there, and looking for funding and ways to get, not loans, but to be able to have angel investors or a culture of VC to support your third, fourth, and fifth stage businesses, I think is so critical. And we could be doing that. I'll stop there, but I think to everyone's point is, first of all, this is a dynamic part of the economy that we're missing out on. And we don't have the luxury, given the complexity of the macro, and I think that point about you have to understand how we're situated macro is so critical. But given that volatility, we don't have the luxury of not leveraging every part of our population to support this economy. And we need to do that deliberately. And then to the point that this isn't just, it's not just platitudes. There are concrete things. I just named a couple in terms of housing development, in terms of transit, in terms of access to government that we can lay out, and we need to approach those things with a degree of not just urgency, but vigor and enthusiasm, because ultimately it's going to help everybody.
But how do we do that? I mean, how do we do that when it seems like there is that cry for, hey, we're here, hey, we're impacting the economy. How does action look? I mean, I don't see action being taken right now. So how does that action look?
I think for me, unfortunately, action has been figuring out myself how I work with others to make things happen. Unfortunately, the systems have not worked in our benefit, and too time consuming, too energy consuming, and we haven't seen the results. So we've figured out, how do we look at this situation where we need to diversify access to capital for entrepreneurs. We need to diversify access to resources to help them thrive and exist and actually grow into profitable businesses. There are all these things that we know are issues, but some of us are getting tired of waiting, right? And that's where the social enterprise aspect of our community is huge, because a lot of us have taken it in our own hands to move forward. I wish I knew what that answer was to actually come up with more systemic solutions where we can actually access resources to make greater impact. But there's also this obsession with scale and turnkey solutions that is not going to get us anywhere. What we're trying to do is it's transformational, and that's investing in humans. And investing in humans takes time, and you're not going to see those results in 2 months. And so a lot of it is also that, like, you're forced to fit into these protocols that are not realistic. So in the end, you end up massacring the projects and the programs that you're trying to do to achieve that good, because you're trying to meet all these metrics that don't even make sense, because in the end, they're not bringing that transformational change that we need.
Justice, do you think that, let's say government has they're trying to do a one-size-fits-all for solutions? Is that what, or do you think it's,
what I would say is we're doing today what we did yesterday because we did it yesterday. And there's a type of isomorphic behavior that, institutional isomorphism. I would say with the government structure stuff, those are, I think that if we look at the recommendations there alone, that needs to come to the referendum, and the people need to weigh in on that. And it was severe, and it's on my mind right now because of it's still being deliberated, but one of the things that we saw in terms of representation on boards, commissions, and committees, especially the ones, land use, economic development, public works, plan commission, they are represented by a very small part of the population deliberately, geographically. And so you have overwhelming representation of the isthmus that are dictating everything. And that's been the way it has been forever. And there's this myth that having all these 103 plus boards, commissions, and committees, that somehow you're allowing for more access, when actually it's doing the opposite. And it's a very interesting, when we looked at that data, it was very interesting to see. And so I think that's another thing that's like, these are actual concrete things. I think looking at our schools and the school district, this is, I don't know if you've ever looked at the elementary school areas in Madison. If you look at it, it's pretty intense, because we have like Stevens Elementary School, if you look at it on the west side, the way that it's broken up into all these areas. So in terms of neighborhoods that are predominantly folks of color in Madison, we have like Mendota, Leopold, and Lincoln, and kind of Orchard Ridge. But aside from that, we don't have any schools in our neighborhood, in and around our neighborhoods, and we're busing our kids all over. And the busing and the transit stuff I already talked about. I think we need to rethink at that level about how we have access to these institutions. And I think a lot of this, where it gets frustrating for everybody is that when we get reports, at this point, especially the disparities between our Black and African American and brothers and sisters, the Race to Equity thing came out in 2013. That wasn't the 30th report. That report had been done, you can find reports that are similar going back 60 years, so like a lot of this is not new stuff. We've been saying this for a long time. This is where it goes back to access and like why we need access to these things, because even though we're saying it isn't, let's just say it's not catching on.
Right, and it's not there, and I think we see it. We've again, going back to COVID, I think that was just, a gross example that, we are so far behind. And you were saying in before the segment, you were saying how it takes like women's issues 10 years, behind. And so talking about those disparities, Ramon, what would you say, and remember what Justice said as far as education, right? Education seems to be in all levels, whether it's civic education, whether it's in our schools, whether it's, in the economy and with our small businesses. How do you think, not only does let's say more regionally, how does the state fare off as let's say if you were to give it a progress report or a report card of some sort, how do you think it would fare off as its impact and intentionality towards reaching Latino populations?
Well, I wouldn't want to give it a score per se.
Okay.
Because I think they do very, very well with certain groups, and they do horrible jobs with other groups, right? But I think the educational system in itself has to be retooled to a 21st century economy. Our educational system is built on a factory model. That's what it's designed for, right? I think we need to open up the space for innovative educational models, whether that's allowing people to engage in dual language immersion, which, having been on the board of Nuestro Mundo in past years, in terms of the academic achievement gap for people of color, it's literally, for those that engage in dual language immersion, I mean, they make significant academic progress, right? Learning two languages growing up, things like that. You see what one city school is doing. We need to be able to engage people and look at whatever they're bringing to the school system as something of value and not try to pigeonhole them into a monolithic educational system. Education needs to be dynamic. It needs to be responsive. It needs to be embedded in the community. Again, I say that there has to be closer partnerships between the K through 12 system and colleges and universities. I mean, and everyone doesn't have to go and get a doctorate. I mean, that's not the reality of it. But people need to be trained in some of the higher skilled areas. The STEM. All those areas are areas of tremendous growth in the future. And unfortunately, without a proper educational foundation, those avenues for economic upward mobility will be out of the reach of most people of color and most Latinos. Now, the difference between now and 30 years ago is that, you had a very small sliver of the population that could fail, that could be marginalized, and everybody else would be fine. When you have a growing population that is going to be a significant part of the population in the next 20, 30 years, you cannot afford to waste away that population. Sort of speaking to what Justice was talking about, you literally, if capital, in terms of monetary capital, if that's what defined the 20th century, human capital will define the 21st century. How well you develop your people is going to determine how well we are positioned both regionally and globally.
And just, I think that example of one city, I mean, one thing in my data, the last time I did a poll was for 2015 data, so I don't know what it looks like now, but this is educational data, is that some of the disparities within our group were bigger than the disparities between the groups. And that says a lot when you're looking at that in terms of how do you actually get in there and do that. And I think what Kaleem has done at One City is he's actually chipping away at that and saying that actually within this, we have to be able to get at that level, at the individual firm or individual site level, and make adjustments. And it isn't going to look like, again, it's not going to be what it used to, because it's a different world, right? So like we have to figure out solutions that are going to be that specific and tailored, and we need to be open-minded about how we come. When those things come, we need to see their value.
I think that there's like this grind against that change, right? I mean, we need more specialized school education. And I had a question for you, Justice, because you have an incubator program, and it's getting people from point A to actually be sustainable and develop wealth. Do you think those models work, and how can we, develop more models like that to fit the needs of each community?
Yeah, I mean, you should say that. It's funny, real quick, that task force on government structure, we did a survey of all the living, former or current board commissions and committee members, all elected officials, et cetera, mayors. And we structured the survey, and basically the answers came back, and the first part of the survey was, basically everyone said they really like the way that it's structured now. And then the second part was everyone really thinks it needs to change drastically and immediately, and you know what I'm saying? And so you get that type of thing. But to answer your question, yeah, the incubators that we run are old. They're some of the oldest and biggest incubators for production space in the state of Wisconsin. One of the challenges that I continuously face in terms of making those vehicles work is that lack of equity. And so when we're trying to, because one of the thing about it, I mean, and when I got to the organization in 40 years, we had 5 businesses that were owned by folks of color in the history of it. In 30 years, I mean, the first one was 86. Since then, we've gotten about 4 more, in 40 months. I have an amazing team. Megan Diaz-Ricks and Rebecca Stevens run that, and they've done a lot. But what we're still running into, at the end of the day, if businesses don't have access to capital, if they don't have access to that working capital for a build-out, and they're not at that level, it's going to be very difficult for them to get in there. And so what you're seeing is a lot of very nascent or first or early stage accelerator programs that are around here. And then they have access to, there's the type of loans and stuff and the grants they're getting are like $5,000 here and $10,000, which, if that's not a lot of money, let me have $10,000. But at the same time, it's going to take a lot because there's a focus on getting these things open, not sustaining them. And I think once businesses get in there and we get in there, then, for us, for instance, at the incubators, like we ask that we all take a responsibility. Now we all really want to see these folks succeed and to thrive. And I think we need to get more of that chain. I think there's a lot of good programs, but I don't know that they're as aligned or connected as they probably could be, which could make that environment, that ecosystem, a lot more healthy.
Right, stronger. And, I think, being over the chamber, I could tell you that at the beginning in the inception of the business, we really need to not only educate them, but give them the right tools so they can succeed. And the benefits to the economy are, they are not only continuous, but we see our children and our children's children benefiting from these programs and the investments. Ramon,
can I add one thing on that piece?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just because obviously it is an issue that I'm extremely passionate about, and I think you're spot on. There is an obsession with starting, and there's an obsession with scaling certain types of businesses, right? In Madison, Wisconsin, across the board, we're leaving out entire industries. So there's certain business owners don't get any sort of recognition or any sort of love because they're not in certain sectors. We know that. They're not the cool sectors to be in business. And unfortunately, that is where the majority of the Latinx and people of color entrepreneurs are. Mm-hmm. So we need more support to be able to do that. And the focus should be not just starting a great idea, is what is your foundation? And how are you positioned as a leader? So when you go back to your question around certain models, I think there's absolutely a way where you can marry a combination of skills, education, needs that address a larger group, but then you can also do a human-centered design that looks at the specifics of that group to really cater to the specific individual needs of each one of them, right? And that is absolutely possible. Do
you think that, talking about like the micro level and in these small incubators, do you think the success rate is much higher? And what are one of the benefits that you've seen in your circles?
I think it really depends on your experience, right? I think a lot of them tend to focus a lot on the pitch or a lot on this. And is that really success long term, right? Are you doing the next tech innovation? Which, yeah, it's important, but we're in all sorts of sectors. Right? And so why aren't we looking at the infrastructure, the foundation that's needed? Whether you're doing this business and you choose to do another one tomorrow, it doesn't matter. It's the tools for success. And a lot of that ends up really coming down to the individual. And what tools do they have to be able to be successful, right?
And, I love again, with both of your organizations, I love that concentrated effort on scaling, and not scaling in the sense of its size, but its knowledge base is, understanding the system. And one thing, Ramon, and going back to you as far as now that you're involved in this whole new business development and being part of the Latino Chamber, what do you see some of the challenges that our startups are going to have to face in, let's say, the next 6 months to a year, and how can government or even just, stakeholders, private and public stakeholders can invest in our community?
Well, I think in terms of the short-term forecast, if you look at some of the feedback that we had gotten at the chamber through surveys, roughly half of the Latino-owned businesses in Dane County were planning not to reopen. They took a major hit due to COVID. And I think as we go through the second wave, you're going to see that attrition of businesses continue. Now, on the flip side, in terms of saving grace, what you have is you have a cadre of seasoned entrepreneurs that are in the community, right? And what you need to do is reduce the barriers for them restarting business. And the only way to do that is to get them working capital. Many of these people started their businesses by saving up their money, borrowing from family members, and were very successful. And then this pandemic completely blew them out of the water, caused them to hemorrhage money, and now they're broke and they don't have the ability to start up again. I think for that cadre of seasoned entrepreneurs, in particular those in the Latino community, we need to find a way to get them working capital as quickly as possible. And I know one of the things that we've been doing at the Chamber was the development of the Prospera microlending model. The idea is to take working capital and move it as quickly as possible to the entrepreneurs that are being trained in the Latino Chamber. And for us as a community, that would lubricate the wheels of commerce, right? Because going through a bureaucratic process, it's itself an enormous undertaking in navigating the cultural nuances of a bureaucracy. When you speak English, it's difficult, let alone if you have a language barrier. So I think what will be critical is for us to be able to get working capital as quickly as possible to that community of entrepreneurs after COVID. That would jumpstart the economy, and that would do tremendous from the standpoint of anti-poverty, right? Because starting a business is the fastest way out of poverty for many, many members of our community.
So, and I think on that, so absolutely, and a caveat, I want to go back in the last couple seconds, the importance of two things in terms of upstream. First of all, the housing thing I talked about before. First, none of those, to me, it's one of the most frustrating things of political vernacular in Dane County is that we talk about affordable housing all the time. And our elected officials say that, and we don't say for whom. Who is it affordable for? And there's nuance there. And one of the things that we're seeing is the types of housing are generally, we're not seeing people building low income 3 to 5 bedroom housing of any type, which makes it very hard for, again, you're thinking about these businesses, but for their workforce and for the business owners, when there is no housing for them to live in, it makes it very, very difficult in terms of how they can move. And I think we need to be very deliberate, and we need to have more limited equity home ownership programs. I don't know that conventional mortgages will do this the right way, and there's a lot of nuance there, but I think more limited equity home ownership, which is a different type of ownership than what you're used to, but it isn't conventional renting. And then on top of that, we need more deliberate efforts at creating low-income housing and owning that, because all the housing we're building, the majority of it is not accessible to again, the bottom 2 quintiles. And then the far upstream thing is we need, again, going back to the education thing, our youth access to the arts and in a focused effort, because a lot of what entrepreneurial spirit is this idea of taking risks and creative risk taking. And a lot of our businesses that, in our incubators, the ones that are successful, Old Sugar Distillery is an amazing business. As soon as this thing started, they were able to pivot to start making hand sanitizer. And that type of thinking, the divergent thinking that allows you to pivot, where you nurture that is in arts education. So, more of a concerted focus on arts education for our youth as well.
I love that, and we have only about 30 seconds to go. I just want each one of you to say one area that you think that government should concentrate on, or our population should concentrate on. Ramon?
I'll give you a couple areas real quick. I think education, education, we need to have a vocal presence in education. Our voice needs to be heard in economic development. We are a demographic and economic imperative. And in terms of civic engagement, we need to be engaged civically.
Well, I just want to thank all of you. I think we ran out of time, but I did want to just, before we close out, I want you, Eugenia, to give us just a positive outlook on what could happen in the next 3 to 6 months.
I mean, honestly, I believe in the talent and strength that we have. There's a lot of amazing creativity, wonderful ideas. If we're able to come together, just identify a few, let's just do it. Let's just do it, and we'll see the results. And, it is about human transformation. We have to invest in our people. We have to invest in our people. I don't believe in one solution. I think it has to be holistic. We have to look at all the different factors and making sure that we're positioning our communities for success.
I really want to thank all three of you. Every time I sit down with all three of you, I always learn and expand my, my dreams and vision for the future. And Justice, thank you for all you do, for being such a fierce advocate. Eugenia, continue impressing and improving, just the way people are living, through economic development and business development. Thank you so much for doing that. And Dr. Ramon Ortiz, you have been not only an inspiration of knowledge, but, a fierce and strong advocate for Latino issues. And I want to thank you again for all you do for our community. And not only do I want to thank my three guests, but I want to thank Paul Funland and also the Cap Times for this wonderful platform they've given us at Ideas Fest to talk about issues that Latinos care about and that impact us. And I hope that you will continue supporting our communities through COVID and past COVID. Have a great night, and thank you to our sponsors for this great platform.
Cap Times Idea Fest 2020 is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors. Presenting sponsor, the Burrish Group at UBS, a financial services firm with global access and a local focus to pursue what matters most for its clients. Major sponsors are HealthX Ventures, backing entrepreneurs who are creating value with digital health solutions. Exact Sciences, pursuing earlier detections and life-changing answers in the fight against cancer. Quartz, health plans built with you in mind. And Madison Gas and Electric, your community energy company whose goal is net zero carbon electricity by 2050. Co-sponsors are Epic Systems and the Godfrey Kahn Law Firm. Other sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Home Savings Bank, Unity Point Health Meritor, Cargo Coffee, and the Forward Theater Company. Media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Please consider becoming a Cap Times member. Learn more at membership.captimes.com.